As I was listening to Corey's children's time, I was thinking about a quote that I'm remembering came from Martin Luther. You can look it up this week and tell me my memory is faulty, but I'm pretty sure it was Martin Luther who said, "If I knew I would die tomorrow, I would still plant a tree today." I think that's a pretty good definition of faith. We get another good definition of faith in this letter to the Hebrews this morning, right? A definition for this rather nebulous faith concept that we call faith. I mean, finally, something we can really wrap our heads around and understand, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Okay, faith is the assurance that we're going to get the things we hope for somewhere, someday, because there's an invisible power of goodness that will somehow, someday, somewhere make it so. Well, that's pretty, but I wouldn't really call it a very substantial definition that we can really wrap our heads around. It is pretty airy, isn't it? And if I was going to build a life on a solid foundation, I would probably want something with a little more meat on the bones. So let's try to put some meat on the bones of this idea we call faith. I'm not going to ask you all to come up with some well-reasoned definition, but I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and just free associate some words. If I say faith, what comes to your mind, okay? So turn to your neighbor, we'll take a couple of minutes and just free associate the words that come to your mind when you hear faith. Okay, so let's do a little shout out. You can probably all hear I still have this cold and my ears are really clogged up, so this isn't gonna go real well, but I'm gonna try really hard to hear what you say, right? So what are some of the words that came up when you just free associated? What do we think of when we think of faith?
Trusting God's promises.
Trusting God's promises. We said trust in my little dyad. Guidance. Hope. Unconditional love. Jesus. Belief. We said peace. Any other words that came up? There is an answer. He has the answer. God has the answer. Surrender. God's timing. I don't like that one, Vicky. Might be true, but I don't like it. My timing is so much easier. All of these things are true about faith and more, right? Sometimes when we speak about faith, we are speaking about belief, about deeply held convictions and values that we have about God, about life, about humanity. Some of us may express those beliefs in what we might call the traditional language of the church, right? The doctrine, the creeds, as in, I believe in God the Father and in His Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Some of us might express them with a little bit more open language, like, I believe God is love. I believe every human being is worthy of dignity and respect. But when we talk about faith this way, we're talking about knowledge, about something we truly believe to be true, about life, about God, about ourselves, about the world. Faith is a creed or guiding principles that we live by. But that's not the only way we can talk about faith. We also talked about trust and surrender, right? These aren't so much beliefs about God, but the sense that God's presence is good, and we can give ourselves to that presence, knowing that things will ultimately be okay. Maybe things won't go so well for us in a given moment, but ultimately there is goodness, and we are held in that goodness. This idea of faith is more relational and emotional. But sometimes faith isn't about belief or about our emotional relationship with God. Sometimes faith is about taking action, a willingness to move from where we are right now into our sense of God's preferred future, to follow God's voice, to follow God's direction, to take what we would call that leap of faith, to do something, even though we're not certain of the outcome. This is the way of thinking about faith that Martin Luther King Jr. described when he said, faith is taking the first step, even when we can't see the whole staircase. All of these ways of thinking about faith and experiencing it are true. But when it comes to the letter of the Hebrews, I think this author is most interested in faith in action. You don't hear it from that first definition, but you hear it as this author elaborates all of chapter 11. Because chapter 11 kind of reads like, not bankruptcy, but it reads like the superhero's roll call of faith. If you read the entire chapter, what you get is person after person in the Old Testament who did something beautiful for God, not knowing what the outcome would be, but just believing that they had a conviction, a nudge, something that they were meant to do, and they took a leap of faith and they did it, whether or not they got the outcome that they imagined. Now, we read the part that talks about Abraham, but if you read the entire chapter, and you should read the entire chapter this week, you'll hear stories about Noah, for example, who by faith built an ark before there was ever a cloud in the sky, and everyone ridiculed him for his action of faith. We hear the story of Moses, who by faith gave up all the privileges of wealth and status and power that were his as a Pharaoh's son in order to wander in the wilderness and eventually become the person that saved God's people and led them into freedom. By faith, we hear that Rahab, who was not exactly an upstanding citizen, she was a prostitute, but she helped God's spies, and because of her faithful act, she was saved when her city fell in destruction. We hear that the entire community of God's people took a huge leap of faith when they took that first step on the dry land of the Red Sea and trusted that the waters would not engulf them. Now, I'm sure the author of Hebrews commended prayer and worship and study as important parts of our faith. But in this chapter, he is very, very focused on action, on risk, to follow God's call and help to build that better country, better homeland that we're searching for. This is very much true of Abraham's story. According to the scriptures, Abraham was 75 years old. Just pause and think about that for a moment. 75 years old. I don't think any of us get to make any excuses for not doing what we think God is calling us to anymore. 75 years old, and God says, give it all up. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's house, and go to a land I'm going to show you. God doesn't even tell him where he's going. He doesn't even tell him the destination. And Abraham does it. And as the journey begins, God says, I'm going to give you descendants, more descendants than all of the stars you can count in the sky. And they will have that homeland, I promise, that better place, that better country. But Abraham wandered. He wandered. In fact, that's the very definition of Hebrews, to be wanderers, sojourners. He lived in tents his entire life. And eventually, he had a son. He had Isaac, but he never saw the fulfillment of all of those descendants. Abraham's story reminds us that faith isn't about wish fulfillment. It's not about getting what we want in this life because we're good people. It's about a journey that may or may not culminate in the destination that we're seeking. But it's a journey of a growing relationship with a living God who is forever on the move in us and in the world. Now, the truth is, it is a lot easier to talk about faith like this than it is to live it, isn't it? Because we like certainty. We like stability. We like good stuff. We like to be rewarded for good behavior. Who doesn't? Of course we do. I mean, I would imagine that most of us would say, sure, I'm happy to go on a little adventure of faith from time to time. I'll manage a little bit of uncertainty. I'll take some risks within, a well-prescribed risk-reward portfolio. And I'll do it especially if God lets me read the final page of the story first. And if on that final page, I get all the goodies I most enjoy, right? Like a good house, a good job, meaning, purpose, relationships that work, all that stuff, then yes, I'll go on that adventure of faith. I'll take the risk. But that's not really what God asks, is it? We don't get to read the final page of our story, at least not the final page in this life. Now, we are not alone in our hesitation about this. Of course we're not alone. Nobody wants to take risks like that. It doesn't really sound very rewarding. It's scary, which is exactly why the author of Hebrews writes about all of these heroes of faith. If you remember last week, we talked a little bit about the context for this letter, which is much more like a sermon than a letter. He was writing to second-generation Jewish Christians, right? They had been Jewish, they converted to Christianity, and they were thinking, it is time to throw in the proverbial faith towel. This is getting too hard. We aren't seeing any rewards. Nothing is changing. Nothing is going well for us. We're going to go back and try a different version and see if we get a better result. Like in the beginning of their faith lives, they were passionate and committed. The letter to the Hebrews says, don't you remember how you sold all your possessions and gave your money to the poor? How you worshiped and prayed and you visited the sick and you visited the prisoner. Don't you remember all that good stuff? And I would imagine their response is, sure, we remember all that good stuff. And you said Jesus was coming back any day to reward us. You said he was coming back, and we wouldn't have to keep visiting the sick because there wouldn't be any sick people anymore. We wouldn't have to go to prison because there wouldn't be any more prisons. We wouldn't have to give up our stuff because nobody would be poor. You said he was coming back to make the world right. And here it is, 67 years later, and Jesus is nowhere to be seen, and the world looks just like it did when they began their faith journey, and they're thinking, there has got to be a better, more rewarding way to live, because this world doesn't look so great to us. That's why the author says, don't you know who went before you? Do you know the faith that they had? Do you know that even as they lived the faith, they didn't get all the promises either, but some of them came true, and they're living in you right now. I think we can relate to that, can't we? We look at the world, and it's harsh, and it's cruel, and we give so much, and it still feels like we surrender to violence over and over again, and there's so much hate. And really, are things changing? And we wonder, is faith and mercy and service the best way toward this better world that we're searching for? Maybe there's some different way. And when we feel that, when we feel like the world is harsh and unchanging and our faith in action isn't making enough of a difference, sometimes we just need to be encouraged by stories of those who have gone before us to just help us hang on, excuse me, and get through the day. So this past week, I reread a story of a person who has inspired my faith. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. Anybody heard of her? Yes, right? So Corrie ten Boom is one of many people. We're still uncovering the stories, right? One of many people who helped Jewish families escape into freedom during World War II. She was a Dutch watchmaker and a dedicated Christian who had always spent her life living in service, caring for the poor, trying to make a difference in the world. And when the war began, she realized that much more would be demanded of her, and she decided to say yes. She and her family hid countless Jewish families in their home and helped them escape to freedom. And eventually, she and her father and her sister were all put in a concentration camp as a result of that work. Her father died rather quickly. Eventually, her sister succumbed to an illness, but Corrie got out because of a clerical error, she found out later. And even that time of being in a concentration camp did not stop her from doing the work. She went right back into the resistance, right back helping people. She records her entire journey in a book called The Hiding Place. So as I listened again to her story, there were two faith lessons that stood out to me as something new and important for all of us. The first thing to remember is that she didn't set out to change the world. She didn't set out to bring down the Nazi regime or to do anything huge or incredible. She began by simply saying yes to one invitation. Her neighbors came to her door and asked for help, and she said yes to her neighbors. One opportunity to say yes to an invitation to do something good for the people in front of her. That's all she thought was being asked. But after she hid them and got them to freedom, her friends' friends showed up, and so on, and so on, and so on. And she kept on going. Every faithful person I have ever met who has done something beautiful for God, whether we would consider it very small or very big, it all began with just saying yes to the first step and trusting whatever outcome is to be, God is in charge of that. That's not up to us. We just say yes, and we keep going, saying yes to the first step and the second, and so on. The second lesson isn't really from Corrie, it's from her sister. So just before her sister succumbed to her illness, she told Corrie, "There is no pit so deep that God's love isn't deeper still." There is no pit so deep that God's love isn't deeper still. To me, that is the essence of faith, isn't it? It's not about getting rewards. It's not even about making that difference that we so desperately seek for others. It's about believing that God is bigger than a moment, than our personal lives, than the worst thing that's happened to us, or the best things that happened to us. That in it all, there is this invisible love that supports us when it seems like nothing is supporting us. And that's the source of our strength. That's the source of our action, our belief, our trust, all of it. There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. So what does it mean to live by faith? Does it mean that we all have to sell our homes and move to a country that God will tell us about and become missionaries? Does it mean that we all have to risk our lives to save people that are in jeopardy. Most of us won't be called to those big leaps of faith, but it could happen. I'm not going to say that it is not the calling for any one of us. I do know this, that we won't be faithful to the small things or the big things. We won't find that courage that we need until we learn to respond each and every day to those little nudges, just trusting whatever happens is okay. My job is to respond. When I hear God asking me to do this, I'm just going to say yes and trust the rest. This is how we move from where we are to where we're meant to be. By faith, some of us may face an illness with so much grace and grit that we inspire everybody around us to live. By faith, some of us may work for justice and mercy and grace and make a genuine difference in the world around us. By faith, some of us might just do a great job at the work in front of us and raise compassionate kids. That sounds like, oh, everybody does that, but everybody doesn't, and it is no small feat. By faith, some of us may do acts of forgiveness and reconciliation within our own families that change the future for generations. Living by faith isn't about hunkering down, being deeply convicted of beliefs that never change. It is about finding the courage to move, to believe enough in God that we're willing to risk some things, to go where God is leading, to trust that there is this invisible love that supports us no matter what. We might not see the changes that we want in this lifetime. Abraham didn't. Moses didn't. Jesus didn't either, for that matter. But that doesn't mean we don't keep trying. What changes if we don't? And that better homeland we seek, that true homeland security, it's not a place. It's not a city or a state or a program. We won't find it in a relationship or a job or a government. It's a way of living in harmony with God, and we take it with us wherever we go. Amen.